The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmanonline.com.
Hey, welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast, the only Masonic podcast, yes, still endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. It's not a surprise. It is a badge of honor for us, and we appreciate their love year after year. We are firmly into our 6th season. Yeah, I am finding that hard to believe. And new year, 2026. Thank God we don't have to write checks anymore. I'm Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arce. I want to thank our subscribers on Patreon for being there and helping advance the mission of what we do. $5 a month is all it takes to get ad-free episodes, access to our full back catalog of subscriber extra episodes. That's what we get, a little bonus time with some of our guests. And it's a cool way to keep this show moving forward. We really, really appreciate you being the power behind the podcast. You can get a free 7-day trial to start your Patreon subscription in the description. Yeah, right there. Show notes, you'll find that. Boom, the link to get started is there. We have never done a murder mystery episode before. Is there any way we can get like spooky murder mystery music? Because we're not that type of podcast, but everybody's wife is listening to one now. And for Freemasonry, there really is no bigger story than the Morgan affair. Kind of crazy. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the 1826 disappearance of Brother William Morgan. Now, this is an event that happened in upstate New York that almost killed our fraternity, almost divided our country, and is really hard to separate fact from fiction. So for that, we are honored to welcome our guest this week. She is the author of the book, The William Morgan Affair, Masonic Mystery in Upstate New York, Dr. Ann Bunch. Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really great to be here tonight.
And she provided visual aids to our live streamers. You'll see I'm holding up her book. It's the definitive work here. It's The William Morgan Affair, Masonic Mystery in Upstate New York. And I know we have never done the podcast murder mystery episode here for us. And honestly, I think we would actually have the most ultimate murder mystery story that is still a cold case 200 years later. Before we get into your book and the very meaningful work and the investigation that you did into it, why don't you tell our audience, our listener, a little bit about yourself, what you do professionally, and what led you into William Morgan and Freemasonry in upstate New York?
Sure. I'd be glad to. So I am a forensic anthropologist by trade, and I am from upstate New York. I came from Medina, so born and bred here in this area near the epicenter of the Morgan affair. My education took me to basically start to study bones in archaeological sites. So I worked in South America, got my degrees, ended up getting into academics, just pure academics at Loyola University in Chicago, then at University of Kentucky, and then shifted gears dramatically to work not in academics, but for the Army. And the mission of this laboratory that I joined in the mid-90s was the MIA POW recovery mission. So to search for, recover, and identify missing in action service members or civilians from past conflicts. So I did that, but that's where the missing person focus of my research started. I went from Honolulu to Oswego, New York. So questioning my sanity is definitely open table is open for that. My students wondered about me too when I started to teach again. But I worked there and began to consult for medical examiners, Onondaga County and now Monroe County as well. So I'm still involved in missing person searches, identifying unidentified Jane and John Does. I am now at the State University of New York in Brockport. So that is where I'm currently at and working in the Criminal Justice Department.
This is going to be such a fascinating episode because, like I said, you were kind enough to share the book, The William Morgan Affair. And what I found so interesting about it is that as we talk about a cold case and you being a hands-on forensics. We're going to talk about bones and skeletal remains and all the sinewy stuff. But then also you kind of had to fill in some of the gap with history and actual research because of it's 200 years old and these people aren't around to go investigate and talk to anymore. To start our listener off who might be unfamiliar with who William Morgan is and what the Morgan affair was, it really kind of goes back to the 1820s and this kind of, as you referred to it, the burned over district. Like, what was life like in upstate New York at that time? And who was William Morgan and how did he get this path to become a Freemason?
Yes, this was an interesting time period, and the historians talk about this part of Western New York, possibly part of Central New York as well, as being basically an area that was kind of seeking change. There was a bit of upheaval going on, seeking leadership, reform movements, and in Christianity were popping up and popular. So there's something societal going on that just needed a little bit of fanning for a fire to develop. I think there was also a feeling of maybe have and have not at the time. Who was William Morgan is a great question, because there are almost two William Morgans that are presented pretty much regularly, but one seems to be more popular. If you go to museum, the Holland Land Office Museum in Batavia, you will see one version. It is the scholarly William Morgan, who is a gentleman. Then there's the other depiction of William Morgan that is presented in Dr. Morris's volume, and I also have it in my book side by side. He's a bit of a different character, a little bit unsettled, a little bit disheveled. They called him a boss crank, quote unquote. So somebody who may be a little volatile. Apparently he got into Masonry by supposedly being a member of the Leroy Lodge. But eventually, there was a petition for a lodge to begin in the city of Batavia. His signature was on it in support of that. What I've seen historically reported is that eventually the final petition to start this lodge did not have his signature on it. So Morgan apparently discovered that, felt excluded, and then animus developed between himself and the local Freemasons.
So the only thing I know about Batavia is, of course, William Morgan, his origination.
Right.
I can't remember if it's the Batavia Mud Dogs or the Batavia Muck Dogs, the minor league baseball team.
Muck Dogs, right. Right.
Because it's just something you don't forget.
Right.
And it's interesting being a Freemason, and full disclosure, I'm a Freemason originally from the Albany, upstate New York area. So I'm very familiar with William Morgan and the story of him.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting when you talk to Masons about this, is you never hear that William Morgan is a good guy. He's always the villain of the story. And I guess the big question is there's different versions, and we're going to get into kind of the myths that surround the Morgan affair before we get into some of the real structural evidence. Is the story of him being a printer or working in a print shop and threatening to print the secrets of Freemasonry in some sort of expose, does that still check with you?
Yes, that does. What I gather is that he found others that were disgruntled. Enter David Miller, who was in charge of a printing press and had the ability to print, and encouraged William Morgan at that point to print the secret rituals of Masonry. So, and there were others that were wanting to fund this and kind of taking that side. And that is one thing that I get into in the book, is to talk about, well, where did this attitude come from? Where could people have gotten this kind of, disdain or resentment or disgruntlement, if you will? So David Miller allied himself with William Morgan in this endeavor, and apparently was putting pressure on him to, let's get it done, let's print it, are you ready to go? That kind of pressure from one side. So yes, that was real. He didn't have a printing press himself, but he certainly had access.
And just for our listener, for the historical context here, and we talk about the 1820s. So in America at that time, as weird as this sounds, like Western New York was, in Ohio especially, was considered like the frontier. New York State was not the Empire State. The canal system that we know that brought it, that wasn't happening yet. People were still traveling by horse. Guns had one shot in them. Being a Mason, while it means a lot to us now in modern times, it meant even more back then socially and networks. And the thought of George Washington, he was the first president, but he had already moved on, and we were a couple presidents deep by the time this all started to happen. So when we talk about, his eventual disappearance of September in 1826, America was a much different, and especially New York State was a much different area than what we thought of here. And this is what I really liked about your book, The William Morgan Affair, The Masonic Mystery in Upstate New York. I'll help out our listener. If you're looking to get this, there's going to be a link to buy the copy of this book on Amazon in the notes for this episode. Just open it up when it plays. Dr. Ann did a fantastic job. I mean, the research, I used to watch CSI a lot. I thought I was like reading an episode of, History CSI Batavia at certain points, especially when we get to this part, because I like the straight fact of this is what was going on. So walk us through the established, verifiable facts, not the myth of the disappearance of William Morgan.
Yes, September 1826 is the timeline where William Morgan vanishes, but it's a little bit of known facts that come before there's a disappearance. So September 11th, 1826, William Morgan responds to a claim in Canandaigua, New York, that he has committed a petty theft. Apparently, he did not return a shirt and a cravat that he borrowed, which technically could be called theft if you wanted to do that in a civil suit. So he responded to that claim, went to Canandaigua, and like you said, it's not like going to Canandaigua from Batavia today. It's a journey. So it took some effort to get there right. In the evening, I think of the 11th or possibly the 12th, I'm not exactly sure on the date, he is waiting for this hearing and is then seen to be getting into or being shoved into, so take your pick, a carriage, horse-drawn carriage. As you said, we have horse travel at this time. The horse carriage is driven by Freemasons. He is taken out of Batavia to Ridge Road, right along the lake, Route 104 for people who live here, heads towards Fort Niagara, eventually gets to Fort Niagara, then boards a small boat into the Niagara River, goes out towards the Canadian side of the river, and stops. There are Freemasons that are taking him across. They get to the other side without him with a separate boat to communicate with the brothers on the other side, and they're not ready to receive him. So apparently the plan was, let's get him out of Batavia. Let's get him to another country. There's debate about whether this was something he agreed to and was part of, or was it against his will? There's a question about that. Since they were not ready to receive him on the Canadian side of the Niagara River, he was turned around and taken back to Fort Niagara and kept in the powder room. So this is where the original plan appears to go south, and a plan B kicks in, where he is held in a powder room, starts to get a little bit upset, maybe is given some spirits, and that doesn't help. Gets a little bit louder, people can hear, a little bit ornery and belligerent, and eventually the person that maintained the keys to the powder room is called away, I believe on September 17th, to go repair a lighthouse in the Canadian side of the river. He's gone until the 21st, and when he comes back, William Morgan is not there in the powder room. So somewhere between the 17th and the 21st of September, something happened to William Morgan, and that is when he disappeared.
Because 1826 is 200 years ago, we didn't have air tags. We didn't have cell phones. So it taking 3 days before you noticed that somebody was not around. probably wasn't uncommon. Heck, even 30 days.
Right. Giddens, the person who was repairing the lighthouse, when he returned on the 21st, he had given someone else the keys and the ability to manage Morgan and the powder room and the whole situation. Something happened there, and the record doesn't reflect clearly what did happen. So then there's a couple possibilities there. There's a possibility that he was taken out to the river and pushed overboard, bound and unable to swim and support himself, or pushed over the falls. That's one possibility, is the river he meets his demise. The other possibility is he was eventually taken across to the other side, given a horse, given some provisions, was supposed to await his wife and children who were in Batavia, and disappeared alive on the other side.
Two things. When you say the other side and the falls, just for people that aren't familiar with that central western part of New York, you're talking about Canada and the Niagara Falls.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. And they weren't big tourist destinations as they are now. So there wouldn't have been a lot of witnesses and people around on the boats with the little...
Not at all. No, not like today.
That's what makes this interesting. Now, we're going to get to some of the fallout and how the William Morgan affair actually grew into a political movement and almost became the death of Freemasonry here, at least in New York and across North America. But let's get to where you get inserted in as an investigative, research-driven scientist, as a forensic crime scene person. And that's when we find a body in 1827? When in 1827, and where did they find it?
Right. They find a body washed up on the shores of Lake Ontario in Orleans County. So that is the mouth of the Oak Orchard River / creek that empties into the lake near Carlton, New York. It's now called Point Breeze. So there, a body was discovered. A coroner's inquest was called, which was kind of an in-place autopsy that was set up after the British system. And what had to happen is a coroner would have to, every county had 3 coroners. A coroner would be called, they still do today. And then I think 12 people from the jurisdiction where the death was discovered or occurred have to be assembled. And they would basically witness what happened and kind of confirm, yes, this did happen. So they're witnesses to the whole thing. And the body was, basically treated according to protocol, established stature, established gender, established, as much as they could about what happened. And they did say it did not seem consistent with Mr. Morgan. So they were aware he was still missing, and they made a statement, no, the biological characteristics don't seem to be consistent with Mr. Morgan. They temporarily bury him in Orleans County, awaiting notification of maybe the next of kin or somebody who might know who he is. So they put out a news article, body found. In Batavia and Monroe County, people get wind of this, especially a politician named Thurlow Weed, and they basically respond and want to see the body. And they call a second coroner's inquest. And they take David Miller, the printing press individual, Lucinda Morgan, the wife of William Morgan, Thurlow Weed, who has a printing press of his own in Rochester and is a politician in the New York State Assembly, and others, and they go and inspect the body and conclude that it is William Morgan. They bring the body to Batavia kind of on parade and actually set the decomposing remains out in someone's yard for a period of time. So they make a statement, and people say it was quite obvious and unforgettable that witnessed it. And then apparently bury him temporarily, albeit in this old cemetery on Harvester Road, which I discuss in the book and have photographs of. So that's the second coroner's inquest. And eventually family members of another individual from Canada hear that there's a body found, respond, give incredibly detailed description of the clothing that he's wearing, including sewing repairs done by his wife, enough information to say, "We know what? We probably need to do another inquest." So they do another inquest in Genesee County now and eventually determine that this is not consistent with William Morgan. In fact, it is the husband of this woman and her son and friend who appeared to have the inquest called, and his name is Timothy Monroe. And so the body is exhumed and taken home to its final resting place in Canada.
Jeez. Okay. So as you're talking about this, I'm like, all right, I know that 200 years ago, bodies probably decomposed at the same rate as they do now. But obviously, there was temporary buryings, a lot of touching, and like investigating and crime scene police work was much different than what's done now.
Oh, yes, much different. The coroner's inquests, they did use similar processes if they could. For example, and this is one thing that really blows my mind, is that dental identifications are very solid, even today. A forensic dentist is worth their weight because they really can, if they have the dental records, now we use x-rays. They didn't do that in the past at the time of William Morgan. But they would basically look at dental records, and William Morgan did have very special teeth. He had something called double teeth, which are teeth that basically develop differently, and you're born with this condition. It might be noticeable, it might not. You're fine clinically, there's not going to be a problem, but people notice this about him. So to me, to misidentify an individual, Timothy Monroe, and say this is William Morgan, where Timothy Monroe's teeth were present, they weren't double teeth. So it seems very non-scientific to have even stated for a split second that those remains were Timothy Monroe.
And then I'm still trying to figure out, and I'm sure our listener might be in the same boat as well, like what was so special about William Morgan's disappearance? It wasn't like he was well known, maybe even well liked, or it wasn't like a public, it was, where was the outrage? I understand there's a loss of life and everybody cares about that as a fellow human being, but what made him so special that a member of the New York State Assembly was like, I must investigate this?
Right. So this is why I couldn't avoid getting into history and politics, because this was integral into the case kind of continuing to have life. He's missing. He may or may not be dead, or he may or may not be alive. We do not know. But Mr. Weed was extremely interested, seemingly to kind of fan these flames of the coals that we were talking about, of dissatisfaction in the area, maybe resentment, maybe whatever it was, disgruntlement. There was some political aim, have a kind of counterculture point of view to drive home and get attention and maybe get votes for whatever elections were happening at the time. Supposedly, Thurlow Weed was confronted by individuals after Timothy Monroe was positively identified and taken to Canada back home. And Thurlow Weed was quoted as saying something about, well, it was good enough Morgan at the time. So the good enough Morgan is the quote from Thurlow Weed. There's debate about whether he really said it or not. On his deathbed, I believe he stated, I didn't say that. But the quote was still there and very interesting at the time.
Because I'm sitting here thinking, okay, this was all happening about within 15 years of the War of 1812 and the sentiment that Americans had, and thinking there's the have-nots, there's the haves and the have-nots. So we've always still had that, economic issue. You're in upstate New York. There's really not a lot going on up there at that time. Here's an opportunity to seize some sort of movement or moment. So was it literally just the fact that, hey, this guy disappeared and supposedly 3 of the people that it disappeared with were Freemasons, and dun, 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 that's the mystery?
Yes, it was that kind of the who done it. We think we know. You all were angry with him because he was going to publish secret rituals, and it was that threat, and then the response to "don't do it, please." The begging of the Freemasons in the Batavia area to try to dissuade him from doing that. So then taking him possibly by carriage, to Fort Niagara. Why was that done? So it just seemed like the fact that we're transporting somebody, and it hasn't been concluded that he was going along with it. Because if we think about it, he was under a lot of pressure in Batavia. There were forces coming at him from both sides. There's a witness named Whitney who had a lot of details about this time, and he said that he met with William Morgan. He was down. He was possibly even suicidal at the time, and maybe wanted to get out of the situation. So that is a possibility. But yes, I think just the fact that guilt by association, and there were people that stood trial for kidnapping, for conspiracy to kidnap. Those trials did occur in 1827 and after.
A few seasons ago, we had a Masonic historian, Brother Chris Ruley, come on, and he had talked about how Americans felt after George Washington when it came to the subject of Freemasonry, and that George Washington was beloved and trusted. And he's like, well, he was, but you got to remember who gets to write the history, the victors, right? And you think of like Shays' Rebellion and trying to set up a federal government for the first time, and it still exists today, 200 years later, where you have two sides of a political party spectrum and people with different viewpoints. So not to take anything away from the loss of a human life, because as your book points out clearly, this still is a 200-year-old cold case. And in your William Morgan Affair book, in chapter 5, you talk about the Pembroke skeleton. And what I loved about this is when we were talking about biological evidence and how things were preserved in 1826 and how it's different than today. But some of the diagrams that you put in that they were using to measure or examine, who is this Dr. E.A. Phillips, and what did you think about his findings?
Yes. So the Pembroke skeleton was something that I had not heard about until I started to get into researching the Morgan affair and who William Morgan was and what happened. And it was a 1881, so we see it years later, decades later, he's back again. And what happened was in Pembroke, near Akron, New York, there was a skeleton found. Along with it were found interesting, I guess we'd call them artifacts or personal effects. A ring with the inscription WM, a kind of metal lockbox with burned papers, but they were legible enough to see the word Henry Brown, and other items. Um, those two stood out because they're kind of obviously identifying the skeleton with the ring as a personal effect as William Morgan, or the implication is that this is William Morgan, and that the papers are implicating that Mr. Brown. Oh, yes, another word that was visualized was murder on these burned papers in this metal box. So E.A. Phillips did exist. He was a medical doctor in Pembroke. He had a microscope, which made him able to assess maybe the ring and the papers. However, I found it very interesting when I read about the situation that the bones were sort of just shoved off to the wayside, and the ring, the personal effects, and the papers were sort of the focal point. And it came up in local news first, and then literally like a day or two later, it hit the New York Times. Bones found, William Morgan discovered, that type of headline. And I found it very interesting that there was no report on the bones at all. I asked the county clerk, is there anything? No. There was the ability at that time to look at the skeleton and make some determinations about the biological sex, the age the person died, whether they were an adult or not. For example, you could get some very basic information. Their height, you could determine this, and their science was out there if people wanted to do it. But I was just fascinated when the bones were just like, okay, let's move these over here. Let's look at the personal effects, which would not today be an acceptable way to identify anyone. So, yes, I found it interesting. He's a medical doctor, Mr. Phillips or Dr. Phillips, but he wasn't focusing on the biological information when he looked at the case. I also found it interesting there was no death certificate issued. You have to have a death certificate. If it's a skeleton or a body, you still need a coroner to sign off. If that is Mr. Morgan, then finalize this. And I think that's because there's truly no physical evidence. I mean, the upshot is we don't have a body, and you can say that and go, yep, need a body. We don't have any evidence of any violent altercation or anything. We have words. And honestly, the ring and the box and the papers from 1881, those weren't retained either. So nothing is retained. You can't, when I think about a detective looking at a cold case, they come in, they're said, this is your case, just focus only on this. That's kind of how I treated this. You might get a file cabinet full of stuff, you might get boxes. But in this case, there's really no boxes. There's just, it's really claims, rumors, gossip, and claims. When I got to the tail end of my research, what I wanted to do is put in this book everything that I gathered, because there's a lot about William Morgan out there, but it's kind of in separate places. It's in separate books, booklets, even online. And I tried to assemble everything kind of in one place, and I'm sure it's not exhaustive. But as far as the suggestions about what happened, I did put them kind of in an orderly fashion and went through them to see and tried to vet as best I could. Mind you, when I was doing this research, I started in January 2020, and we all know what happened right around then. So traveling and going to Wisconsin to a county clerk's office and that kind of thing was not going to happen at the time. But I had the internet, so I was able to do a lot of work with census data and communicating by email and that kind of thing. So basically going through what the suggestions were as to what happened besides saying he died at the hands of others in the Niagara River. Taking the alternate view that he made it across the Niagara River to Canada, that's a whole realm of possibilities. Apparently, in Batavia, since Mr. Morgan was missing, there was an effort to try to find him. And scouts were sent out to search for him on the other side and the Canadian side. And they did see him. This is the report back to scouts that were sent out, that he was seen riding westward, and eventually, as he was trailed by the scouts or detected by the scouts, boarding a ship at Port Hope. So if that happened, then he could, all the other possible rumors, he was in Boston, he was in New York City, he was in Smyrna, Turkey, that all could happen after getting on that boat, that ship. But one of the things that really stood out to me that seemed to have a little bit more kind of evidentiary potential was this family claiming relationships to William Morgan on wiki ancestry. And it's like an ancestry.com. There's a family, Morgan family in Utila, Honduras, who claim that their patriarch is William Morgan. And there's a William Grantham Morgan who was supposedly his son, whose photo is there available to see. And they claimed that it's about the right time that this could have happened, that William Morgan might have started a whole separate life in the Caribbean. If that's true, then you can compare the family lines, Jeanette. So he had a daughter and a son in Batavia that were very young when he disappeared. If he started another family in Honduras, we can compare the Batavia family line to the Caribbean family line and either use Y chromosome DNA, which would have to be a male relative. Now, he did have TJ the son. TJ had a son, but you would have to track that down genealogically to hopefully find a relative that's living today from TJ's line. And then Ward Grantham Morgan from Utila, Honduras, he does have plenty of relatives that have made their way back to the United States, San Antonio, I think California, there's some others. So They're out there to be compared in Y chromosome DNA, but this would mean you have to contact them, basically have them voluntarily contribute a swab, a buccal swab, and you could do that comparison. Another way is this forensic investigative genetic genealogy. This is done basically by genealogists who have access to genetic data that is either obtained by warrant or obtained because it's publicly available because someone checked that box when they turned their sample into 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and others. So the genetic genealogists could compare those two lines, the Caribbean line and the Batavia line, and see, do they look like they have a common relative? If you get too far away, we're all going to be fairly similar. But if you get close enough relatives to William Morgan, you could make that call with this forensic investigative genetic genealogy. So that's a non-invasive way to do this research and maybe find out if he did live on in the Caribbean.
Thanks again to my guest this week, Dr. Ann Bunch, the author of The William Morgan Affair, Masonic Mystery in Upstate New York. Want to get your hands on a copy of her book through Amazon? Oh, dude, we got the link right there. Click on the show description and the notes, boom. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Craftsman Online podcast, next week, the first conversation with Right Worshipful Brothers, who are New York's first Buddhist, Muslim, and Hindu Grand Chaplains. That's going to be a good one. Until next time, I'm Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arce. Let peace and harmony prevail.